"Don't you dare die on me," Mercy Calloway said, pressing both hands against the wound in Ethan Vance's side. "Not after everything it took to find you." He didn't answer. His eyes were open, fixed on the cracked ceiling of the line shack, but his breath came in shallow pulls, like a man rationing something he knew was almost gone. Outside, the wind combed through dead grass with a sound like paper tearing. Somewhere past the ridge, thunder rolled low and long, promising a storm that hadn't decided yet whether it would arrive as rain or fire. 3 days ago, Ethan Vance had ridden into Widow's Bend a stranger. Dust-caked, silent, a rifle across his saddle and a name nobody in town could confirm. 3 days ago, Mercy hadn't known his voice, let alone the low, cracked way he said her name when the pain got bad enough to peel back whatever wall he kept around himself. She hadn't planned on kneeling over him in a shack 10 miles from anywhere, blood soaking through her petticoat, praying to a god she'd stopped speaking to the year her father died. But here she was. Mercy Calloway ran the boarding house at the edge of Widow's Bend, a town that had learned to survive on rumor and thin soup, and she'd learned to survive by asking no questions of the men who paid for a bed and a meal. Ethan had paid in silver and silence. He'd kept to himself in a way that wasn't shy. It was practiced, the way a man keeps to himself when he spent years making sure nobody gets close enough to be used against him. She should have left it there. A border was a border. But she'd seen the way his hand went to his hip whenever the saloon doors banged too hard, the way his eyes swept a room before his feet ever crossed the threshold. She'd seen a man carrying a war nobody else could see, and something in her, something stubborn and unhealed since her own losses, refused to look away from that kind of pain. "You don't know me," he'd told her the first night, when she'd set a second plate at his table without asking. "Best you keep it that way. I don't need to know a man to feed him," she'd said. He'd eaten. And something in the silence between them had shifted, quiet as a latch clicking closed. Then, 2 nights ago, 4 riders had come asking after a man matching his description. A man wanted for a killing up in Cheyenne territory, they said, though the way they said it made Mercy's skin crawl more than the words themselves. Bounty men didn't usually smell of cheap whiskey and old grudges. These 4 smelled like something worse. She'd warned Ethan before sundown. He'd looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt it in her chest, and said only, "You shouldn't have told me that." "Why not?" "Because now I have to decide whether to run, and every time I run, somebody good gets hurt trying to help me not get caught." He'd run anyway, out toward the old Hargrove line shack where nobody but drovers ever set foot. And she, fool that she was, or maybe not a fool at all, had followed on her sister's mare with a bag of bandages and a Colt she barely knew how to fire. She'd arrived to find him already bleeding, already half collapsed against the doorframe, a bullet wound low in his side where one of the riders had caught him crossing open ground. "You came," he said now, voice cracking as her hands worked to stop the bleeding. "You shouldn't have come. I keep hearing that. I mean it, Mercy. Whatever they think I did, whatever they're saying. I don't care what they're saying." She tied the bandage tight, hard enough to make him hiss. "I care whether you live long enough to tell me what's true." Thunder cracked closer now, and somewhere out past the ridge, she heard it. The unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats, for sets, moving unhurried and certain. The way men move when they know exactly where their prey has gone to ground. Ethan's hand found her wrist, gripping with more strength than a dying man should have. "Listen to me," he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice held no wall at all, just fear, plain and unguarded. "If they find us here, you tell them you didn't know. You tell them I forced you. You hear me? I won't lie for you and I won't leave you," Mercy said, and her own voice shook now, tears rising hot and sudden in her eyes. "Not after you're the first man in 3 years I haven't been afraid to sit across a table from." The hoofbeats stopped just beyond the tree line. A voice called out into the dark, rough and almost cheerful. The voice of a man who has hunted before and expects to enjoy it again. "Vance, we know you're in there. Come out easy, and maybe the woman doesn't have to answer for helping you." Ethan's jaw tightened. His hand slid, trembling, toward the rifle propped against the wall. "Whatever happens," he whispered, pulling her gaze to his, "I need you to know. I only feel safe when you're near. First time in 6 years I've felt that with anybody." Mercy Calloway, who had sworn after her father's death that she would never again let her heart break itself open for a man who might not live to see morning, felt the tears finally spill down her cheeks, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous. Hope. The voice outside called again, patient as a man counting cards he already knew he'd win. Last chance, Vance. Come out or we come in, and we won't be careful about who's standing next to you. Mercy pressed her palm flat against Ethan's chest, feeling the frantic drum of his heart beneath torn cotton and old scar tissue. Tell me the truth, she said. Right now. Not what you think I want to hear, the truth. What happened in Cheyenne? He looked at her like a man deciding whether honesty was a mercy or a cruelty. There was a man named Silas Reed, he said finally, words dragged out between clenched teeth. Cattle baron. He hired me to ride guard on a herd drive, then blamed me when half his stock turned up missing. Stock his own foreman had been selling on the side for 2 years. When I found the ledgers proving it, Reed's men jumped me in the dark. I killed one of them defending myself. Reed's been paying bounty men to hunt me down and shut my mouth ever since, dressing it up as justice. And the men outside? Reed's riders, not lawmen, never were. Mercy sat back on her heels, feeling the shape of the choice settle over her like a physical weight. If she believed him, if she opened that door or fought or fled with him, she was choosing a stranger's word over the safety of everything she'd built in Widow's Bend. Her boarding house, her standing in town, her own careful, guarded peace. If she didn't believe him, she could still walk out that door right now, hands raised, and tell the riders the truth. That she'd only just arrived, that she owed this man nothing. She thought of her father, who died refusing to sign over grazing rights to a man twice his size in cruelty, because principle had mattered more to him than survival. She thought of the 3 years since, spent making herself small and careful so nothing could ever hurt that badly again. Then she thought of Ethan Vance's hands, steady enough to mend a fence for old Widow Hutchins without being asked, gentle enough to calm a spooked horse with nothing but a low voice, and the particular way he'd looked at her the first night, like a man remembering what it felt like to hope. Get up, she said, reaching for the rifle. If we're doing this, we're doing it together. Mercy, don't. She checked the rifle's chamber with hands that only shook a little. Don't waste breath telling me to leave. You've already used that argument. It didn't work the first time. A ghost of a smile crossed his pale face, gone as quickly as it came. You're either the bravest woman I've met or the most foolish. Ask me again if we survive the next hour. Outside, boots crunched against dry earth. The riders dismounting, spreading out. Mercy could hear them now through the shack's thin walls. Low voices, the metallic click of rifles being checked. A laugh that held no humor in it at all. Window, Ethan breathed, nodding toward the shack's single grimy pane. They'll come through the door first, try to draw us there. You take the window side. Don't shoot unless they force it. I want a way out of this that doesn't end in more graves. Even Reed's men? Even them. I've killed one man already, Mercy. I don't want that number climbing higher than it has to. It was, she realized, the kind of answer that told her everything she needed to know about him. A man hunted for months, cornered and bleeding, who still reached first for restraint over vengeance. Whatever else was true about Ethan Vance, he was not the killer Silas Reed's wanted posters made him out to be. The shack door shuddered under a hard knock that wasn't really a knock at all. More a warning blow, testing the wood. Vance! The voice called again. We're coming in. Anybody else in their dies for choosing wrong company. Mercy's grip tightened on the rifle. Beside her, Ethan forced himself upright against the wall, blood loss making him sway. Jaw set with the particular stubbornness of a man who intended to still be standing when it mattered. Whatever happens next, he said quietly, thank you for not asking me to be someone I'm not. Thank me after, Mercy said, by staying alive long enough to prove it. The door groaned. A shadow fell across the gap beneath it. And somewhere far out past the ridge, the storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke. Thunder rolling down over the shack like the opening note of something neither of them could stop now. The door burst inward on the second kick, and the shack filled with rain-scented wind and gunmetal light. The first man through was broad-shouldered, hat pulled low, a shotgun already leveled. Mercy fired from the window side before conscious thought caught up with instinct. A single shot that took the shotgun clean out of his hands and sent him stumbling back into the mud with a howl more surprise than pain. "She's armed," someone shouted. "Watch the window." Ethan moved then, faster than his wound should have allowed, throwing himself sideways as a second shot splintered the doorframe where he'd been standing. He returned fire once, aiming low and wide. A warning, not a kill shot. And the man in the doorway ducked back out into the rain, cursing. Ethan Vance. A new voice now, older, colder, carrying the particular calm of a man used to being obeyed. Reed's foreman, Mercy guest, or Reed himself. "You know how this ends. Come out and maybe the girl walks free. She's not part of this." Ethan shouted back, dragging himself toward the shack's rear wall, where a gap in the boards offered a narrow line of sight. "Let her go and I'll come out unarmed." "No," Mercy snapped, low and fierce, grabbing his sleeve. "We already decided. Together." "Mercy." A shot tore through the wall between them, close enough that splinters sprayed across Ethan's cheek. He flinched, swore, and returned fire through the gap, and outside a man cried out and went silent. Rain hammered the roof now in a steady roar, thunder rolling almost continuously, the storm and the gunfight tangling into a single, chaotic violence. Mercy's ears rang. Her hands, slick with rain and old blood, fumbled to reload, muscle memory from her father's brief, insistent shooting lessons years ago rising up through the panic. "There's two left," Ethan said, breathing hard, pressing a hand against the fresh ache in his side. Reed's the older voice. "He won't come in himself. He'll wait for the last man to flush us. Then we don't wait for him to decide when." Before Ethan could argue, Mercy was moving low, fast, toward the shack's rear door, the one that led out onto the old cattle pen where their horses stood tethered and terrified in the storm. If she could reach the mare, draw fire away. "Mercy! Don't!" But she was already through the door, into the driving rain, and a shot cracked out immediately, close enough that she felt the wind of it pass her cheek. She dropped low behind a rotting fence post, heart slamming, and heard Ethan's voice roar something behind her. Not words, just raw fury, followed by rapid gunfire. When she dared look back, one of Reed's men lay motionless in the mud near the shack's corner, and Ethan was on his knees in the doorway, rifle still raised, blood now soaking dark through his shirt in a wide, spreading stain. "Last one," the cold voice called, and this time it was closer, moving around the side of the pen toward Mercy's position. "Where'd your girl run off to, Vance? Brave or just stupid?" Mercy's breath caught. She was out of cover, rain blinding her, rifle half reloaded, and the man's shadow was already falling across the fence rail beside her. She didn't think. She swung the rifle up and fired. The shot went wide. She wasn't a gunslinger, never had been. But it was enough to make the man flinch, stumble sideways into the mud, giving her one precious half-second to scramble backward toward the shack. That half-second cost her. A hand closed hard around her ankle, yanking her down into the mud, and she found herself staring up into a face she recognized with a jolt of horror. Not Reed's foreman at all, but Silas Reed himself, older than she'd expected, eyes flat and merciless in the lightning flash dark. "You picked the wrong man to protect," Reed said, raising his revolver. A single shot cracked through the storm, not from Reed's gun. Reed's eyes went wide with something between shock and disbelief. He swayed once, then collapsed sideways into the mud beside her, unmoving. Behind him, framed in the shack's ruined doorway, blood-soaked and barely upright, Ethan Vance lowered his rifle with hands that had finally stopped shaking, and then his knees buckled beneath him and he went down hard into the rain. "Ethan!" Mercy scrambled through the mud toward him, all thought of danger forgotten. "Ethan, stay with me. Stay with me." His eyes fluttered, found hers, held on with the last of his strength. "Told you," he managed, voice barely a whisper beneath the thunder. "I only feel safe when you're near." Then his eyes closed, and the storm swallowed everything but the sound of Mercy Calloway screaming his name into the dark. He didn't die. 3 days later, in the small back room of Mercy's boarding house, Ethan Vance opened his eyes to gray morning light and the smell of coffee and carbolic soap. and found Mercy asleep in the chair beside his bed, still in the same mud-stained dress she'd worn the night of the storm, her hand resting on the edge of his blanket as though she'd fallen asleep mid-vigil and refused to let go even in dreaming. He watched her for a long moment before he spoke, memorizing the shape of her, the furrow between her brows even in sleep, the small scar above her eyebrow he'd never asked about, the exhaustion carved into every line of her. "You've been there 3 days," he said finally, voice rough with disuse. Mercy startled awake, blinking, and then the relief hit her so hard she had to press both hands over her mouth to keep from sobbing outright. "You absolute fool," she managed. "You nearly died on my kitchen table. I've been told I have a talent for nearly dying." He tried to smile. It came out crooked and pained. "Where's Reed's men? The ones who lived? Ran once their boss went down. Sheriff Halloran rode out with a posse yesterday. Found Reed's ledgers still in his saddlebag. Proof of everything you told me. Words already spreading through town. Seems the great and terrible Ethan Vance was innocent all along. Doesn't feel like much of a victory," he said quietly. "Man's dead. Others scattered. Nothing brings back the years I spent running." Mercy reached out then, hesitant, and closed her hand over his, the first time she'd touched him since the storm without the excuse of tending a wound. "No," she agreed. "But it's a start." He turned his hand beneath hers, palm to palm, and for a while neither of them spoke. The silence comfortable in a way silence rarely was between two people who'd only known each other a handful of days. "Can I tell you something?" he said eventually. "Something I haven't told anyone in 6 years?" "You don't have to. I want to." He took a slow breath, gathering himself. "My wife died 6 years ago. Fever, not violence, nothing dramatic, nothing I could have fought against. I was 3 states away, working a drive, and by the time word reached me she'd already been buried 2 weeks. I told myself after that I'd never let myself need anybody again, because needing somebody means you can lose them, and I couldn't survive losing anybody else." Mercy's throat tightened. "Ethan, let me finish." His thumb moved gently against her knuckles. "Then Reed's lies chased me into your boarding house, and you set a second plate at your table without being asked. And something in me that I thought had died with her started waking up again, whether I wanted it to or not. I fought it. God, I fought it. But lying in that shack, bleeding out, the only thing I could think about, the only thing that mattered was whether you'd be safe." Tears rose in Mercy's eyes, hot and unstoppable, spilling silently down her cheeks. "I lost my father 3 years ago," she said, voice thick. "Watched him stand up for what was right and pay for it with his life. After that, I told myself the same thing you did, that caring about anyone that much was a door I'd never open again. I kept everyone at arm's length. Boarders paid, ate, left. That was the arrangement. Simple. Safe. And then you sat at my table and thanked me for the food like nobody had ever fed you kindly before in your life, and I couldn't stop thinking about the sadness behind your eyes, and I hated myself a little for how much I wanted to fix it." He reached up, slowly, and brushed a tear from her cheek with a hand still bandaged from the fight. "I meant what I said in the rain," he murmured. "I only feel safe when you're near. I don't know what that makes us or what happens next, or whether a man with my history has any right to ask a woman like you to risk anything more for him. But I know I'm done running from the one thing in 6 years that's made me feel like I could stop." Mercy leaned down, resting her forehead gently against his, careful of his wounds, careless of everything else. "Then don't run," she whispered. "Stay. Heal. Let this town see the man I already know you are." Outside, the storm that had raged 3 nights past had long since cleared, leaving Widow's Bend washed clean under a pale morning sun, the kind of light that made even the harshest, most unforgiving corner of the territory look, for a little while, almost gentle. 3 weeks later, Ethan Vance stood in the doorway of Mercy Calloway's boarding house, healed enough to walk without wincing, watching Sheriff Halloran ride up the muddy main street with a folded paper in his saddlebag. "Come to make it official," Halloran said, dismounting with the stiff formality of a lawman closing a case he was glad to be rid of. "Territorial marshals cleared your name, Vance. Reed's ledgers, his own foreman's confession. It's all there in black and white. Whatever bounty was on your head, it's gone. You're a free man." Ethan took the paper with hands that, for the first time in 6 years, didn't tremble at the weight of it. Free, he repeated, testing the word like a man and used to its shape. Free, Halloran confirmed, then glanced past him, toward Mercy standing in the boarding house doorway, apron dusted with flour, watching with an expression she no longer bothered to hide. Course, seems to me you found something better than freedom out at that line shack. Whole town's talking about it. Let them talk, Mercy said, stepping forward, slipping her hand into Ethan's without hesitation. Halloran chuckled, tipped his hat, and rode on toward the sheriff's office, leaving the two of them standing together on the porch in the thin autumn sunlight. Free man, Ethan murmured, turning the paper over once more before folding it into his coat pocket. Never thought I'd hear those words again. What will you do with it? Mercy asked. Freedom, you could ride on. See the country. Nobody chasing you now. He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked, the way he had that first night at her table, except now there was no wariness in it, no wall left standing. I've spent 6 years running toward nothing, he said, just to keep moving away from the pain of standing still. I don't want that anymore. I want to stay here in Widow's Bend if you'll have me, not as a boarder paying for a bed, but as something else. Something permanent if you're willing. Mercy's breath caught. Ethan Vance, are you asking me what I think you're asking me? I'm asking, he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, his voice held no hesitation at all. If you'll marry a man who spent years believing he didn't deserve to feel safe again, because you're the reason he does. She didn't answer with words. She answered by closing the last small distance between them and kissing him there on the porch, in full view of Widow's Bend's morning traffic, tears of joy this time instead of grief slipping unnoticed down her cheeks. Old Widow Hutchins, passing by with her market basket, paused just long enough to mutter, about time, before continuing on her way with a satisfied smile. Years later, when travelers passed through Widow's Bend and stopped at the boarding house that had grown, over time, into the finest inn between two territories, they'd sometimes ask about the worn wooden sign hanging above the door. 2 names carved deep into old oak, weathered but unmistakable, Ethan Mercy Vance. If they asked Mercy about it over supper, she'd smile and say only that it commemorated a very bad storm and a very good decision. But sometimes, on quiet evenings when the rain came soft and steady against the windows, she'd catch Ethan's eye across the room, and he'd reach for her hand the way he had 100 times since that first storm-soaked night, and she'd remember every word he'd whispered to her in the mud outside a dying man's shack, words that had become, in time, not a confession of weakness but the foundation of everything they'd built together. I only feel safe when you're near. It had been true then. It was true still. Every evening the lamps were lit and the door was locked against the dark. 2 figures settled together before the fire. Proof that even a man who has run from grief for 6 long years can find, at last, somewhere worth standing still.